2022 marks the 150th anniversary of our community, Fowler, California. My name is Eric Haddon, and I'll be your host through this Sesquicentennial series of episodes as we celebrate 150 years of community, tradition, and progress. Since starting this interview series, I've had the opportunity to speak with a number of members of our community about what life has been like in Fowler over their lifetimes and what makes this community so unique. While the sense of community is often referenced, another popular hallmark is the sense of safety and security that accompanies life in a small town. It's an atmosphere that is markedly different from a large metropolitan area. One only needs to walk down Main Street on a Saturday morning to get a sense of what these people mean when they refer to the charm that is a part of a community like Fowler. With 150 years' worth of history, it likely comes as no surprise that there have been those events that have been so disruptive, so monumental, that they have pierced the veil of safety and security of the town that we call home. This episode is about one such event, how members of the community of Fowler chose to respond in the immediate aftermath, and how one family sought to help bring closure to wounds that were opened so many years ago.
Up to the 25, and now he's hit and hit hard about the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tackle. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further developments, which will be broadcast immediately as received.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
A bulletin from New York. Mayor Fiorello H. LaGuardia, Civilian Defense Director, announced tonight he had ordered all Japanese nationals in New York City to remain in their homes until their status is established by the federal government.
December 7th, 1941 would become the inflection point that would formally draw America into the global conflict that was World War II. Meanwhile, in the weeks that followed the attack, anti-Japanese sentiments at home were reaching a fever pitch. On February 19, 1942, a mere 74 days after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would issue Executive Order 9066, a presidential order that authorized the United States military to establish specific military zones throughout the West Coast and forcibly detain American citizens within these zones. While Order 9066 did not specify any ethnic group, in the wake of the order, U.S. Army Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt of the Western Defense Command proceeded to announce curfews that applied only to Japanese Americans. 1 month later, General DeWitt would issue Public Proclamation No. 4, which initiated the forced evacuation and detention of West Coast-based Japanese American citizens with only 48 hours' notice. Over the next 6 months, 120,000 Japanese American men, women, and children would be detained within fenced and guarded relocation centers. More than 70,000 of these detainees were American citizens, Americans held without any due process, evidence of espionage, or any chance for an appeal. One such relocation center would be hastily constructed on the site of what is now the Fresno Fairgrounds. Between May and October of 1942, the site would house more than 5,000 Japanese Americans who were residents of the county of Fresno during the enactment of Order 9066. This would be one of 13 such detention centers constructed across California and would be the first stop for detainees before they were relocated to more permanent facilities throughout the United States. Forced to leave their homes, their livelihoods, and any vestiges of normalcy behind, many Japanese Americans would spend the next 4 years detained inside these facilities without any ability to safeguard what they had left behind. Understanding how potentially devastating this experience would be, a group of concerned citizens in Fowler banded together to help their Japanese American neighbors.
This one account that came to mind when Juan asked me to talk about Fowler and our family centers around World War II when the Japanese were interred.
The voice you hear is that of Tom Feaver, a man whose roots in Fowler go back 140 years. He's been gracious enough to share his story about how his family contributed towards protecting their neighbors in the wake of their internment.
And I'm not sure where this particular family was interred, but I do know that, I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but this account is actually accounted for in a book written by David Masamoto, called, is it Requiem or Epitaph for a Peach? Epitaph for a Peach. It's mentioned in there as well, but it talks about being a good neighbor. During World War II, many of the Japanese people, as they were forced to relocate for that time, they came home to who knows what. They came home to homes burned. They came home to homes that were just rifled and people had stolen things from them. And then there were people that had good neighbors. And one of the neighbors was a gentleman by the name of Cam Oliver. And he was married to my Aunt Vivian. And he actually, on a handshake, verbal agreement, arranged to farm this family's property and send them a check once a year during that time of interment, and then handed everything back over to them when they came home. And he kept saying, "Hey, they're my neighbors. I was always taught to treat people the way that I would want to be treated," and he lived it out. He lived it out under, from what I've learned from my cousins, was a fair amount of pressure from the community, who didn't take kindly to him
doing this.
Yeah, and I won't mention the terms that they used to, but there was Cam Oliver, there was Jess Hayes, and I think Bryce Feavor, I think, was another one that were involved in hauling washing machine down to the camp, upon their request. So yeah, that was one thing I think that depicts the kind of person that lives in Fowler. They'll take care of their neighbors and help their neighbors, regardless of what they look like.
For those detained inside the camps, life would develop its own cadence and routine. In the fall of 1943, renowned photographer Ansel Adams would document the conditions inside one such internment camp when he visited the Manzanar Relocation Center. Located at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Inyo County, California, Adams' pictures captured the daily life of detainees, including what family life was like inside the barracks, people at work as welders, farmers, and garment makers, and recreational activities like baseball games. Adams would publish these pictures in 1944 in a book entitled Born Free and Equal. When writing to a colleague about the book, Adams remarked that, through the pictures, the reader will be introduced to perhaps 20 individuals, loyal American citizens who are anxious to get back into the stream of life and contribute to our victory. While World War II would officially conclude in September of 1945, the government would close the remainder of the internment camps by 1946. Many Japanese Americans who once called Fowler and the Central Valley home would leave the area in an effort to rebuild their lives in other parts of the country. As Ansel Adams would capture with his photographs, there was a flow of life inside the camps that constituted a routine, but there were still an innumerable number of events, milestones that were missed, never celebrated or commemorated while inside the camps. One such event were graduations from high school. In 2003, 60 years after the Japanese Americans were interned, the California State Assembly passed AB Bill 781, a bill that would retroactively bestow high school diplomas to the Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans who were interred during their graduating years. The next voice you hear is that of Julie Maldonado. Julie was born and raised in Fowler and had relatives who were interned inside the camps. Julie shared with me the story of how her daughter, Jordan Maldonado, went to work locating those Nisei students from Fowler High and bringing them home to receive the recognition that they had been denied for so many years.
Well, it started because the principal at Fowler High School at the time, Joanne Abhold, she received information the state superintendent of education sent it out to the entire state of California because it was an Assembly Bill 781 that passed to give high school diplomas retroactively to Nisei graduates who were interned behind barbed wire during World War II and didn't participate in graduation. And she approached me. Our daughter was a freshman, Jordan Maldonado, very active in the high school. And Joanne asked if that would be a project we would be interested in taking the lead on. And it really dovetailed into Fowler Unified's belief in community service. And also Jordan was a very active member in Fowler 4-H Club. And she took that on kind of as an historical community service project for 4-H and also for the high school. And it just snowballed. During World War II, there was a very large population of Japanese Americans in Fowler. And when they were all interned, interestingly enough, in the Fowler High School yearbook called the Latoria, it mentioned that they literally had to lay off faculty because of the impact of the Japanese student body who left. I don't know if they were maybe at least a quarter of the high school enrollment at that time in the 40s. It was a very large, population of the student body. So anyway, our daughter started and she worked with some of the older Japanese Americans in Fowler who, had relatives or family who were all affected by this. And she came up with a list of 87 Niseis from Fowler High School who did not receive a diploma. She also learned during her research that 23 of them had already been deceased. She spent 5 months just researching and getting addresses and phone numbers and that type of thing. And after 5 months, 27 of these Nisei actually applied for their diploma, but only 14 could attend. The others couldn't due to distance, and at that time in their 80s, a lot of them had health issues and they couldn't travel. We found most of them in Southern California, but there were some in Illinois, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Utah, and one lady from Chicago did fly out, and she is, in this picture on the board. And because the school district embraced this project and got so involved, there was a state office for the California Nisei High School Diploma Project based in San Francisco. So they came down and they chose Fowler High School as the site for living history workshops, where we brought in people of this age who actually experienced World War II and being interned in camp. And they put all the junior and senior history classes through these panel discussions with the Niseis. Even I learned things that I had never heard about. And interestingly enough, the Japanese culture, you're kind of stoic. Whatever befalls on your life, particularly hardship, you just press on. That is their philosophy. So actually, when I went to Fresno State, I took an Asian American Studies class just to learn more about my culture. And the professor asked, there were about 24 students in the class, how many of your parents have told you what happened to them during World War II? And not one person raised their hand because no one talked about it, ever. They were ashamed, embarrassed. It was painful because most of them were gone, 4 years. So that was our term report for my, college class, was to go home and interview your grandparents, your parents, your relatives to find out what happened during World War II to the Japanese Americans on the West Coast.
How forthcoming were they during that process?
You know, they just kind of gave the facts. There wasn't a lot of emotion to it. I think so much time had passed and they were just so used to containing it. But I remember in the living history workshops at Fowler High School in, I guess it would have been 2005, the students were just shocked.
Yeah.
And they couldn't believe this happened here. You know, it was unconstitutional. Sure. People lost their businesses, they lost their homes, they lost their farms. A lot of Japanese Americans did not return to Fowler because they had nothing to return to. My grandparents in Fowler were very fortunate because an African American family, they took care of my grandparents' home and 40 acres for them. And that did happen to some Japanese American families. But not all, and probably not most. So a lot of them just ended up, after World War II, migrating to larger, big cities.
Looking through the lens of the past, is it hard to believe that we as a country did this to our fellow citizens?
Yes, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. I think if they tried to do it now to Japanese Americans, because we're all third and fourth generation Americans now, I think we would protest, speak up, seek legal recourse. But it was very easy to shepherd the Japanese first and second generation at that time. They were trying to prove they were good Americans. Like my grandparents had two sons who were in the U.S. Army protecting our country, but yet they were all, you know, the rest of the family was in prison behind barbed wire, essentially. So that part's ironic. And the scary part to me, and I'm getting a little bit political, is I'm seeing some of this come back against the Muslims or maybe the Jews or other ethnic groups. And to me, it's very scary because when history is really evil, it should not repeat itself. We should learn from the past. And that part does, you know, it is scary, I think. But anyway, going back to this California Nisei High School diploma project, our daughter did it solely and with the focus of getting her great aunt, Harriet Shirakawa Ishibashi, who was the only one of 7 Shirakawa children who were all born and raised in Fowler. She was the only one who didn't get her diploma. All the rest of her siblings were older. So that was really the intent of our daughter taking on this project for Fowler High School, was to get a diploma for my aunt or her great aunt. And she was actually, you know, physically there at the graduation ceremony.
Now, the internet in 2005 was not nearly as developed as it is today. I imagine it was fairly difficult to find information on some of these individuals.
It was really a community project in the sense the older Japanese or the Niseis who were still living and knew a lot of these families back during World War II. They helped significantly at least get us the names in as many addresses as they could. And as our daughter was contacting the ones that we had contact information for, she kept including missing people. And so we really got it down. So out of the original 87 people, there were only 7 that we never found. Because it was really more of a word of mouth project. The internet back in 2004 and 2005 was not very robust. So I don't even recall that we used it that much. Yeah, it really was, you know, a Japanese community helping our daughter, you know, to kind of right a wrong and give these Niseis a high school diploma over 60 years later.
Did you have the opportunity to attend the graduation?
Yes, and all the major TV stations were there. It was the front page of the Fresno Bee the next day. The Associated Press picked up the story and they ran it internationally because I understand it showed up in a lot of Asian countries, including Japan and Korea. And it kind of defined our daughter for years. It just kind of became what she was known for. A lot of high schools reached out to her after Fowler did theirs to see how do you get started. She was selected to speak at the state graduation ceremony. So Assemblywoman Sally Lieber, who introduced AB 781, she spoke first, introduced Jordan because of her project at Fowler High School, and then Jack O'Connell, who was the California State Superintendent of Education, he spoke after Jordan. And actually my aunt was invited to attend that ceremony in San Francisco, and she lived in the Bay Area. So it was just a project that ended up giving back to our daughter tremendously.
You had the opportunity to talk to them at the graduation. What did it mean to the Nisei to participate in this ceremony?
They couldn't believe it. They thought it would never happen. One man, Roy Cotto, who actually was my neighbor in Fowler, he was in his 80s, of course, by the time he attended, was not in good health, and they actually built ramps instead of steps to the graduation platform, and one of his sons wheeled him on across the stage to receive his diploma. The community was wonderful. We had like a high school graduation party for the Nisei graduates in the cafeteria, and all the local and state and regional political office holders, all attended. It just got a lot of attention because it was such a unique story, I think, and so overdue. And Fowler was just great because they supported it right from the beginning. And I think that made a huge difference on the reception and the welcoming. As you can see, they're all in their caps and gowns. They marched across the stage, with the class of 2005. Yeah, it was just news-breaking, really.
Are there any other stories you'd like to share?
Well, I'd like to touch a little bit about my grandparents. My grandfather came from Japan in 1906, and he met someone in San Francisco when he literally got off the boat who talked him into going to Sanger. And, my grandfather had no skills. He was 18, didn't speak English, didn't know anybody. So he was a farm laborer for a brief time. And he ended up, I'm not sure at what point, but coming to Fowler for just better opportunities. So he ended up, buying a small farm out on Fowler Avenue, going out towards Selma. And then eventually he bought the 40 acres with the home on Adams and Armstrong, which is now developed into, a 74 house development by KB Homes. And the reason I'd just like to talk a little bit about my grandparents, and my grandmother came in 1913 from Japan, also at age 18, but they ended up being business, community, and church leaders in Fowler. In 1920, my grandfather, Tokyo Shirakawa, he started a Japanese investment corporation which handled insurance and stocks for the Japanese in Fowler or the Fresno County area. And then he went on to found the Central California Farmers Co-op in 1946, which had members from 4 counties, and he headed it for 18 years. And the reason he founded it was solely because of discrimination. The Japanese farmers were having difficulty, purchasing or placing orders. So he literally founded a co-op so they could all pool their money and make substantial purchases. In 1961, he helped organize the Central California Fruit Growers Association, which is still in existence today. And our grandmother had been exposed to Christianity in Japan, and she became a very devout Christian. And in 1948, she founded a Japanese Free Methodist church here in Fowler. So anyway, in 1965, they were honored by the city of Fowler as pioneers, and they were grand marshals of the Fowler Fall Festival Parade that year. And kind of in an honor of our grandparents and our family, there is a green space in the new KB Homes development, a park, and that is being named Shirakawa Park after my grandparents, Tokyo and Kikuya Shirakawa. As much of an imprint, I think, the Japanese community had in Fowler, and at one time there was a Japantown here, which I do remember. there isn't a street or a memorial or anything acknowledging the Japanese American community in Fowler. So even though it's named Shirakawa Park, you know, for me it's just sharing with the whole Japanese community for their contributions to the Fowler community.
Thank you again to Tom Feaver and Julie Maldonado for their contributions to this project. A postscript to this episode. While the human toll of the internment of Japanese Americans is incalculable, a study commissioned by Congress in the 1980s put the total economic loss of property alone at $3.8 billion when adjusted for inflation. A special thanks to the members of the Fowler Sesquicentennial Committee who have worked so hard to make this celebration possible. The community time capsule is scheduled to be buried on December 28, 2022. If you have an item you'd like to contribute, please send me an email to hello@voicesoffowler.com, and I'll send you the instructions on how you can contribute your item.